So you want to hear about the time I absolutely destroyed my backstabbing boss using nothing but spreadsheets and patience? Buckle up, because this story's got everything: corporate theft, sweet revenge, and a $12 million lesson in why you don't mess with the person who actually knows how the numbers work. I'm 32, and I was a senior data analyst at Meridian Retail Holdings. Was being the key phrase here, but we'll get to that. You know those people who say data is boring? Yeah, they've clearly never used it to systematically destroy someone's career, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you a picture of where this all started. Meridian's this massive retail chain, think somewhere between Target and Walmart in terms of size. They've got distribution centers scattered across 15 states, and their inventory management was, to put it politely, a complete disaster. Products sitting in warehouses for months, empty shelves during peak shopping times, millions of dollars literally just sitting there collecting dust. It was chaos. That's where I came in. I'd been working there for about 3 years, and I developed this forecasting model that was honestly pretty brilliant, if I do say so myself. It used machine learning algorithms to predict demand patterns, seasonal fluctuations, even weird stuff like how weather affects shopping habits. Like, did you know that a 10-degree temperature drop increases sweater sales by 23% within 48 hours? My model knew that. The thing was absolutely revolutionary for them. We're talking about preventing stockouts before they happened, optimizing warehouse space, predicting which products would be dead weight before the buying team even ordered them. In my first year after implementing it, I saved the company over $4.2 million. The CFO, Lydia Hart, was singing my praises in every quarterly meeting. She'd literally stand up and point at my charts, talking about how my innovative predictive analytics were transforming their bottom line. I felt pretty good about myself, you know? Finally felt like I was making a real difference, like my work actually mattered. I even had this little watermark embedded in all my dashboards, just a tiny M Analytics in the corner. Nothing flashy, just professional recognition for my work. Then everything went to hells. Enter Greg. This guy was Lydia's college buddy from way back. Apparently they were in the same MBA program at or something. Typical corporate hire, you know the type. Expensive suit, firm handshake, says things like synergistic solutions and paradigm shifts with a straight face. Lydia brought him in as VP of Strategic Operations, which basically meant he was supposed to optimize our operational efficiencies. From day one, this guy rubbed me the wrong way. He had this habit of nodding along during my presentations like he understood everything, then asking these super basic questions that showed he clearly didn't grasp even the fundamentals of what I was doing. But whatever, right? New guy, learning curve. I tried to be patient. The first red flag should have been when he started asking for deeper access to my forecasting dashboard. He claimed he needed it for some high-level strategic planning. I was hesitant. This model was my baby, you know? I'd spent years perfecting it, and it contained some pretty sensitive data about supplier relationships and profit margins. But Lydia backed him up, said something about fostering collaborative leadership, so I gave him read-only access. Big mistake. About 2 weeks later, I'm scrolling through my LinkedIn during lunch, and I see this post from Greg. He's sharing some industry article about innovative retail forecasting, and his comment made my blood run cold. He wrote, and I quote, "Excited to share some of the groundbreaking predictive analytics work I've been developing at Meridian. Innovation happens when we think outside traditional retail paradigms." I clicked through to see what he was talking about, and I literally dropped my sandwich. There was my dashboard, my exact dashboard with my algorithms, my data visualizations, my prediction models, everything, except for one tiny detail. My watermark was gone. Instead, there was a new label in the corner: Strategic Analytics Suite. Can you believe that? This guy had literally stolen my work and was passing it off as his own creation. I sat there staring at my computer screen, feeling this mixture of rage and disbelief wash over me. I mean, I'd heard about this kind of thing happening, but experiencing it firsthand, it felt like someone had just punched me in the gut. I immediately sent him an email, trying to keep it professional but firm. Something like, "Hey Greg, I noticed my forecasting model is being presented as your work. I think there might be some confusion about the attribution. Can we discuss this?" His response came back within 10 minutes. "I appreciate your contribution to the data gathering phase of this project. However, the strategic implementation and analytical framework represent my own innovations. I think you're overestimating your role in the development process." Overestimating my role? I built that entire system from scratch. I wrote every line of code, designed every algorithm, validated every data source. This wasn't some collaborative effort, it was my work, stolen and rebranded. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went to HR. Jennifer Martinez, the HR director, listened to my complaint with this practiced, sympathetic expression that immediately told me how this was going to go. She nodded at all the right moments, took notes, promised to look into the situation thoroughly. 2 days later, she called me into her office for what she called a collaborative resolution meeting. Greg was there too, looking supremely confident. Jennifer starts talking about how intellectual property in a corporate environment can be complex, and how the best path forward is to focus on team success rather than individual recognition. Then she says something that I'll never forget. Greg has explained his strategic vision for expanding this forecasting capability. Rather than getting caught up in questions of attribution, perhaps you could work with him to ensure the continued success of the initiative. After all, we're all on the same team here. Greg actually had the audacity to smile and say, "I'm sure understands that innovation is about moving forward, not looking backward. I'd be happy to keep her involved in the data maintenance aspects of the project." Data maintenance, like I was some kind of intern whose job was to update spreadsheets. I walked out of that meeting knowing exactly where I stood. The company was going to protect their VP over their senior analyst, even when the VP was a lying, credit-stealing snake. They wanted me to shut up, play nice, and let Greg build his career on my work. But here's the thing about data analysts: we're patient, we're methodical, and we think about long-term consequences. Greg wanted to play games? Fine, I'd play games, but I was going to play by rules he didn't even know existed. The first thing I did was quietly start documenting everything. Every email, every meeting note, every version of my models, I saved it all in a secure, encrypted folder that only I could access. Then I started making some very subtle changes to the systems Greg now claimed to own. See, when I originally built the forecasting model, I'd made it accessible through a public API that other departments could query for their planning purposes. Marketing used it for campaign timing, procurement used it for ordering schedules, finance used it for budget projections. The whole company had integrated my system into their workflows. But I'd also built in some safeguards that I'd never told anyone about. Call it professional paranoia, but I always included backdoor access controls in my systems, just in case. I quietly deprecated the public API and migrated the live model to a password-protected container that only I could access. To everyone else, it looked like the system was running normally. The dashboard still updated, the report still generated, the interface looked exactly the same. But what they were seeing now was basically a demo version, running on 3-month-old data with limited functionality. The real model, the one that actually worked, the one that could prevent those million-dollar mistakes, that was locked away, accessible only through my personal authentication key. Greg, of course, had no idea. He was too busy taking credit for his innovation to actually understand how it worked. He kept scheduling these strategic planning meetings where he'd present his forecasting insights, completely oblivious to the fact that he was working with increasingly outdated information. Meanwhile, I was watching the real data, seeing the patterns he was missing, watching problems develop that his stolen system couldn't detect, and I kept it all to myself. The breaking point came in October, when Greg called an all-hands meeting to announce his strategic initiatives for the holiday season. He'd apparently promised the board that his revolutionary forecasting methodology would deliver double-digit margin improvements during the crucial fourth quarter. I sat in that conference room, watching him click through slides that contained my work, listening to him explain concepts he clearly didn't understand, and I felt this cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't just about stolen credit anymore. This was about Greg making promises he couldn't keep based on systems he didn't control, with consequences he couldn't imagine. He was setting himself up for spectacular failure, and he was going to take a lot of innocent people down with him. The holiday season is make or break for retail. Get your inventory forecasting wrong during November and December, and you're looking at millions in losses, either from stockouts that kill sales or overstock that has to be liquidated at massive discounts. Greg's stolen system was about to fail him when he needed it most, and I was the only one who could see the disaster coming. But instead of warning him, I decided to let physics take its course. Sometimes the best revenge is just stepping back and letting someone's own incompetence destroy them. The first signs of trouble started showing up in early November. The forecasting dashboard that Greg was so proud of started generating these weird inconsistencies. Product demand predictions that didn't match historical patterns, inventory recommendations that seemed off, seasonal adjustments that made no sense. Greg initially tried to handle it quietly, probably hoping he could figure it out before anyone noticed. He started cutting me out of strategy meetings, which was fine by me. He also started reassigning some of my junior analysts to what he called special projects, basically trying to build his own team that could troubleshoot his stolen system. The problem was none of them understood the underlying architecture of what I'd built. They could see the front-end interface, they could read the reports, but the actual predictive algorithms, the machine learning models, the data preprocessing pipelines, that was all black box to them. Meanwhile, I was running my real forecasting model in parallel, watching the accurate predictions diverge more and more dramatically from what Greg's system was showing. By mid-November, his recommendations for holiday inventory were off by an average of 30%. He was telling the procurement team to order massive quantities of products that were going to be slow sellers, while missing the actual high-demand items that would fly off the shelves. I documented everything, of course. Screenshots, data exports, prediction accuracy comparisons, all time-stamped and encrypted in my private files. I was building a complete record of how Greg's incompetence was about to cost the company millions. The beautiful part was I didn't have to do anything malicious. I didn't sabotage his system or manipulate the data. I just stopped helping. I let him own his innovation completely. Around Thanksgiving, things started getting really interesting. Greg scheduled a performance review meeting with me, claiming there were concerns about my visibility and collaborative attitude. Apparently, some people had noticed that I wasn't as engaged in the strategic planning process as I used to be. The meeting was classic corporate theater. Greg sitting there with his leather portfolio, talking about alignment and team dynamics. He actually had the nerve to suggest that my recent disengagement was affecting team morale and that maybe I needed to reconsider my commitment to collaborative success. I just nodded and smiled. You're absolutely right, Greg. I should definitely focus more on supporting the strategic initiatives you've developed. I'll make sure to stay out of the way and let your systems work exactly as you've designed them. He seemed satisfied with that response, probably thought he'd successfully intimidated me into compliance. What he didn't know was that I'd already reached out to Sarah, the enterprise risk auditor, under a non-disclosure agreement. I'd shared my real forecasting data with her, along with detailed projections about what was going to happen during the holiday season if the company continued following Greg's recommendations. Sarah was smart enough to understand what she was looking at. She quietly scheduled a routine compliance review for mid-December, officially focused on inventory risk management procedures. Nobody questioned it. These kinds of audits were standard operating procedure. But Sarah and I both knew what we were really going to be reviewing. Black Friday came and went, and Greg was absolutely triumphant. He sent out this company-wide email about how his strategic forecasting initiatives had enabled record operational efficiencies during the biggest shopping day of the year. What he didn't mention was that the efficiencies he was celebrating were mostly due to understaffing and reduced inventory levels that made their numbers look good in the short term, but were setting up serious problems for the rest of the season. I was watching the real data and I could see the disaster building. Inventory levels in key categories were dropping below safety thresholds. Popular items were starting to stock out. The procurement team was scrambling to place emergency orders at premium prices, trying to cover the gaps that Greg's system had missed. Meanwhile, other categories were massively overstocked with products that weren't moving. The warehouses were filling up with slow-moving inventory that was going to have to be liquidated at massive discounts after the holidays. By the first week of December, the cracks were starting to show. Regional distribution centers were reporting capacity issues. Some were at 150% of their intended storage capacity, while others were running critically low on high-demand items. Greg was starting to look stressed. He was working late every night trying to figure out why his innovative forecasting system was generating increasingly erratic recommendations. He'd brought in consultants, upgraded hardware, even hired additional data analysts. Nothing helped because the fundamental problem wasn't technical. It was that he was working with a deliberately neutered version of my system while claiming to understand something he'd never actually built. The executive team was starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Lydia called several emergency meetings to discuss inventory optimization challenges, and Greg found himself in the awkward position of trying to explain problems he couldn't actually understand. That's when I implemented the final phase of my plan. Remember how I'd built safeguards into my original system? Well, I'd also included what you might call a dead man's switch. If my administrative credentials weren't properly maintained and updated, the system would automatically revert to a stripped-down baseline mode with significantly reduced accuracy. On December 1st, I let my credentials expire. Suddenly, Greg's forecasting dashboard was only accurate to within plus or minus 25%. For a system that was supposed to predict inventory needs within 2–3% margins, this was basically useless. It was like trying to perform surgery with oven mitts on. Greg was in full panic mode now. He was sending urgent emails about technical difficulties and system optimization challenges. He tried to get it to restore my access levels, but I'd built the authentication system in such a way that only I could reinstate my own credentials. And I wasn't feeling particularly cooperative. December 14th was the day everything finally came to a head. Sarah convened her routine compliance review meeting with all the senior executives in attendance. Lydia was there, Greg was there, plus the heads of procurement, finance, and operations. Sarah started by presenting the inventory analysis she'd been conducting. Stock turn charts, capacity utilization reports, demand forecasting accuracy metrics, all the boring technical stuff that executives usually just nod through. But these numbers were impossible to ignore. Over $12 million frozen in excess inventory, regional distribution centers operating at 150% capacity, stockout rates 40% higher than the previous year, customer satisfaction scores dropping due to product availability issues. Greg tried to jump in with explanations. Well, you see, we've been implementing some strategic adjustments to our forecasting methodology, and there's naturally going to be some optimization periods as we calibrate the new systems. Sarah cut him off. Actually, mister, I'd like to show you something interesting. She pulled up a new set of charts, my real forecasting data, the predictions I'd been running in parallel for the past 3 months. Time-stamped, documented, and accurate to within 2% of what had actually happened. This is an alternative analysis that was provided to me by one of your team members, Sarah said. As you can see, these projections, which were generated months ago, accurately predicted every major inventory issue we're currently experiencing. The room went dead silent. Greg's face went pale as he realized what he was looking at. Furthermore, Sarah continued, this analysis includes specific recommendations that, if implemented, could have prevented most of these problems. The analyst who provided this data has also prepared a corrective action plan that could recover approximately $8 million of the frozen inventory through strategic reallocation and vendor negotiations. Lydia's voice was very quiet when she asked, who provided this analysis? I stood up, that would be me. You could have heard a pin drop. Greg was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. Lydia looked like she was having trouble processing what she was hearing. Sarah said, would you like to explain to the leadership team how you were able to generate forecasts that were so much more accurate than the current system? I smiled. Well, it's actually quite simple. The current system is based on my original forecasting model, but it's running on a deprecated version with limited functionality. The real system, the one that generated these accurate predictions, requires proper authentication and administrative access to function correctly. I paused, looking directly at Greg. Access that was revoked from me several months ago when I raised concerns about intellectual property attribution. The next 30 minutes were some of the most satisfying of my professional life. I walked the executive team through exactly what had happened, how Greg had stolen my work, how HR had dismissed my complaints, how the current crisis was the direct result of trying to use a system that nobody actually understood. I showed them my documentation, my saved emails, my time-stamped files. I explained how the real forecasting model worked, why Greg's version was failing, and exactly what it would take to fix the current disaster. When I finished, the room was completely silent for what felt like forever. Finally, Lydia spoke. What would you need to implement your corrective action plan? I was ready for this question. Full reinstatement of my administrative access to all forecasting systems, formal recognition of my intellectual property rights, direct reporting relationship to you with autonomy over the data science team, and a written apology from HR for their handling of my original complaint. Greg tried to object. Now wait just a minute, I think there's been some misunderstanding about the development process for these systems. Greg, Lydia's voice could have frozen helium. You're suspended pending a full investigation into these allegations. Please collect your personal items and report to HR immediately. He sat there for a moment, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then he gathered his leather portfolio and walked out of the room without another word. Within 48 hours, I had full access restored to all my systems. I immediately deployed the real forecasting model and started implementing the corrective action plan I'd been developing for months. The recovery was honestly pretty remarkable. By reallocating surplus inventory from overstocked regions to high-demand areas and negotiating return agreements with key vendors, I was able to free up over $8 million in frozen capital. We couldn't fix everything, some of the damage was permanent, but we managed to salvage most of the holiday season. HR not only reversed my poor visibility performance review, they issued a formal written apology and added a commendation to my file recognizing my exceptional dedication to protecting company assets. Jennifer Martinez personally delivered it, looking about as uncomfortable as I've ever seen another human being. Greg's employment was terminated for cause after the investigation confirmed everything I'd documented. His resume disappeared from the corporate directory like he'd never existed. I heard through the grapevine that he'd had to settle some kind of legal action to avoid SEC scrutiny over his misrepresentation of company assets to investors. The best part, though, was my promotion. Lydia made me director of predictive analytics, with a salary increase that was honestly more than I'd dared to hope for, plus a retention bonus tied to forecast accuracy metrics that I got to write myself. But you want to know the real cherry on top? 3 months later, quarter-end profits beat projections by 6%. The board of directors circulated my forecasting methodology company-wide as a case study in safeguarding intellectual capital. My team asked me afterward how I'd managed to stay so calm through the whole ordeal. I told them something I really believe. Data has no ego, it just waits to be believed. The truth is, I never really got angry. I mean, I was frustrated and hurt when Greg first stole my work, sure. But once I realized what was happening, once I understood the scope of his incompetence and the magnitude of the disaster he was creating, I just waited. I knew that reality would eventually assert itself. Numbers don't lie, and bad forecasts have consequences that can't be hidden forever. Greg could steal my credit, but he couldn't steal my competence. Eventually, the difference between what he claimed to know and what he actually knew was going to become impossible to ignore. I just made sure I was ready when that moment came. These days, I spend a lot of time mentoring younger analysts. I always tell them 2 things. First, document everything. Every idea, every innovation, every piece of code you write, make sure there's a clear record of your intellectual contributions. And second, never hand over live access to critical systems without safeguards. Always maintain some level of control over your own work. Because here's what I learned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's just letting incompetent people face the natural consequences of their own actions, then being the person who knows how to fix what they broke. Greg thought he could steal my work and build his career on my innovations. Instead, he built his career on a foundation he didn't understand, using systems he couldn't control, making promises he couldn't keep. And when it all came crashing down, I was the only one who knew how to clean up the mess. That's not revenge, really, that's just professional competence, but sometimes that's the most devastating weapon you can have.